Welcome to the Thinklings podcast, a conversation where good thoughts help renew the mind with the Word of God. I'm Charlie Carter, and I'm here with Tim Little and Andy Stearns. Let's jump into the conversation. Welcome to the Thinklings podcast. We have a special guest on our podcast today, Dr. Pennington from Southern, and I'm going to introduce him a little in a more full sense in just a moment when we get to when he gets to his turn in books and business. But before I do that, thank you for being here, Dr. Pennington.
That's a joy. Thank you.
And let's go ahead and take care of some Thinklings business, huh, Tim?
Books and business.
There we go. Okay, I'll go first. There's a book I finished for a class here at Faith Seminary assigned by Dr. Paul. It's Bioethics. It's a primer for ethics in the medical field. I really enjoyed it. I just finished it a couple of days ago, and it talks about a bunch of ethical issues relating to procreation or reproduction, contraception, gets into artificial wombs a little bit, and a lot of stuff that's way over my head. But if you're interested in that sort of thing, thinking through ethical dilemmas in the medical field as it relates to those types of things, organ donations, etc. It's just a good starting place. I think the author, I don't have his name written down, but I think he's coming from a Lutheran perspective, but has a good worldview, gives some good thoughts. I think I gave it like a 4 or 5 when I posted it on my Instagram. But Bioethics is the name of the book, and it's a good intro level discussion for those types of things. So that's my book for the day.
All right. So I just started a book, so I'm not going to have one to rate yet, but I'll give you a quick preview of it. It's called Pagans and Christians in the City, Culture Wars from the Tiber to the Potomac by Stephen D. Smith. So far, it's really intriguing. I'm only a couple chapters in. Essentially, he's taking an essay by T.S. Eliot about various cultural issues, and he's saying, it seems like maybe that's right. So I'm just going to summarize really quickly. He says that normally when people think through history, what they have done is they've said it's kind of like we were in paganism, and then Christianity comes on the scene, and Jesus is on the scene, and then you have like the Middle Ages where it's mostly the church running the show. And then the Enlightenment takes place, and we move into more of a secular age. So he's going to angle towards saying that a lot of our cultural analysis today comes from that perspective, that today we're like on the right side of history, that sort of thing. Using the Eliot article, and then he's going to make a case that perhaps today it's not going from pagan to Christian to secular, but it's always a back and forth between just a pagan worldview and a Christian worldview. Now, when he says that, he's very careful to say that just because you're in a Christian operating worldview, it may be more of a cultural Christian operating. You're not actually a true believer. But it's intriguing. I don't know how to analyze it yet or assess it, but some of the things he's been sharing are fascinating. And so I would say I'm very interested. It was a recommendation from a listener who's a pastor, and then on the side, he teaches at a classical academy, he and his wife. And so he has found it very enlightening. So I'm looking forward to reading it. So it's Pagans and Christians in the City. No rating yet. Look for that in the coming weeks.
So I have been reading our author's book, Jesus the Great Philosopher by Jonathan Pennington. And since that's going to be what our main topic is, that's not going to be my books and business. Other than this, I've been working on my book, Song of Songs for Singles, and the workbook. So I don't really have a books and business right now. I'm writing, and that's been my focus. I've been in some Song of Songs commentaries, which I'm not going to really rate, but that's pretty much it. So that's my books and business, and that'll help us get to our author and our guest.
Hey, yeah. So what I'm working on right now, just at the beginning stage, is a book about how to effect change in both church and culture with this vision of beauty. And so the tentative title is Building Beautiful Things, but it's it's kind of an expansion of the idea of Christianity as the greatest philosophy of the world, and then thinking about being a people that build beautiful things and invite people into the beauty of God's kingdom. So it's just in the works. It's got a bunch of moving parts to it. So that's what I'm working on right now. In terms of reading, it's all over the place, but I think probably the book that this week has impacted me the most is Kurt Thompson, who's a Christian psychiatrist who's just really brilliant. He's written several books, but his latest one is The Soul of Desire, and it's about beauty. And it's this incredible intersection between neuroscience and what we're learning about neuroscience and the idea of beauty and the Christian faith. And it's super good. I really, really recommend it, and have already learned a lot from it.
So beauty is actually a topic we've talked about on the podcast quite a bit. Something I've studied from an Old Testament theological perspective, and studying the Song of Songs, where the beauty is, of course, human beauty is a prominent theme. Who is the author of that book again?
Kurt Thompson. He's again a psychiatrist, a practicing psychiatrist, and the Anatomy of the Soul, The Soul of Shame, are two of the later books that have been pretty popular, and then this one's called The Soul of Desire.
Cool.
It's really good.
I found it now. Thanks.
He's gonna order some for the bookstore probably. That's what
Good.
Tim always does. So let me introduce our guest a little bit more than just in name from earlier. Dr. Jonathan Pennington. I'm working from his Twitter profile. So these are the descriptions on there. I think there's 6 of them. So we'll just walk through those 6. It says he's a New Testament professor at Southern Seminary, and that is indeed true, correct?
Yes.
How did you get into New Testament? Why not Old Testament?
Yeah, my Greek's definitely better than my Hebrew. I'll just say that. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know beyond that.
Sure. Well, I think that's probably all of us. Our Greek is better than our Hebrew. So,
I think so.
other than Tim.
Horrendous.
So after that, it says husband and father. And we were talking a little bit before we started recording about your wife being from Iowa. So tell us about your family.
Yeah, so my wife and I have been married 29 years, heading towards 30. We have 6 kids who are ages 25, almost 26, down to 16. We all live in Louisville and enjoy each other a lot, spend a lot of time together. And no grandkids yet, but I'm looking forward to that deeply. And my wife's a professional mosaic artist, so she works as an artist and does murals, and she's doing a big outside mural for a city nearby us right now. And so, yeah, our family is very artistic, and everybody's either musical or visual artist, and so which means we're all poor, but poor and happy.
Hey, happiness is a good thing, right?
That's right. That it is.
We're going to get into that in a little bit.
Right.
The next couple are pastor and speaker. So where do you pastor? What's your heart in pastoral ministry? And when you get to speak, what do you normally speak on?
This is a really good way to do the introduction. Nobody's ever done this. I didn't even remember what was on my Twitter handle. That's really good.
I got your back.
Yeah, that's good. I'm the pastor of spiritual formation at Sojourn East, which is one of a family of 6 churches in Louisville that's also connected to a larger church planting network called Harbor Network. We're independent churches, but there's a lot of organic relationships between us. We have a shared pulpit, so I preach about 35% of the time, sometimes a little bit more, and involved in the sermon planning all around. And then I run the men's ministry as well as supervise several of the other staff. It's a pretty large church and pretty large staff. So I supervise the staff that run the women's ministry, care ministry, counseling care, and also community groups. So that's all on my team. And so, it's a joy. It's great. And speak. Yeah, I always say I'm just blessed to have a lot of really good friends who live all over the place and run really interesting things. So pastors and a lot of theological institutes. I'm real connected with the Village Institute and the Village Church in Dallas. And actually there's several relationships there that I travel around quite a bit to the various institutes that are related to the Village or have spun off from it and teach at those. I'm also connected with just again other centers and things that I'm involved with that result in a fair amount of speaking. I think I was this last couple of months has been a lot. I think in January I was on 18 different planes. So, and that included a trip to Italy, which was quite nice for some academic and holiday stuff. But yeah, just it's a joy to travel quite a bit. And just last weekend, I was down at a classical school in Memphis, Tennessee, which was actually, I've only done a few gigs in the kind of classical school world, but the Jesus Great Philosopher book we're going to talk about has begun to have some, I think, helpful inroads to people that are involved in classical schooling, which I didn't write it for that reason, but I think there's a lot of overlap. So that's kind of a newer thing, is to kind of get connected with the classical school movement, which I'm excited about too. So
Yeah, Andy and I, both our children are involved in the
Ah.
classical movement.
okay.
And so I can see the correspondence between Jesus the Great Philosopher. I didn't think about it until you mentioned it, but there's definitely a connection there, plus the emphasis on beauty. When you go out and speak, are you usually talking about beauty, or what might be like the major topic you're talking about?
I do. I've done a lot of work on the Sermon on the Mount and human
Mhm.
flourishing, and so that's one of my books that's, kind of widespread. And so a lot of times I go and teach on the Sermon on the Mount. I teach a lot on Matthew, which is what my PhD is in, and then I teach a lot on Jesus the Great Philosopher. So like I just gave
Mhm.
I did a teacher in service training at this large classical school in Memphis. Like I said, I did an all day thing on basically how Jesus the Great Philosopher relates to the calling of classical education. So yeah, that's
Cool.
yeah, it's fun. So
What's the name of that classical school that you were
it's
at?
called Westminster Academy.
Are they ACCS? Do you know?
I think so. I got connected, probably, yes. I got connected with them because I spoke last summer at the Society for Classical Learning, if you know the SCL, which is a
Hmm.
kind of a more think tank side of it, not the accreditation. I spoke at their national conference
Sure.
last summer, and that's how I got connected with some of those people. So,
We have a buddy just down the hall here, Dr. Boyd, who I don't know if it's that classical school. It might be in Nashville instead of Memphis, but he has a buddy who's an administrator at a school down there, and I'm just wondering if I'll ask him after we're done recording if that's the place. I'm not sure if it is, but yeah, I had never really heard of classical Christian education until the last year or two, and then connecting the dots with the Inklings and Dorothy Sayers and some of those ideas. And now I think most of my students here get little pieces of classical mindset. So anyway, but yeah, Andy, were you going to comment on his trip to Italy?
Yeah,
That
I was
he
just going
took?
to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we know you went to Italy because we were all following on it. Well, me and Charlie were following on Instagram, and maybe just slightly jealous, just a little bit. It looked gorgeous. It looked really cool.
I'll tell you what, January during COVID is the time to go to Italy for sure.
Oh.
In terms of like, there was nobody there, especially in Rome, and so we literally walked into everything, like no lines. I was there with some people who live there, and they were like, "Yeah, we've never seen this. That you could just walk
Wow.
into
It's empty.
walk into the
Oh.
Vatican Museum." Yeah, Florence was a little bit more. My son and I popped up to Florence as well. It was a little bit more crowded, but still, it was a good time to go. So
Something that I was struck by in looking at your pictures is some of these very famous works of art that I've seen on like book covers and things. They're huge.
They're
They're
huge, yeah.
absolutely huge. Like, were they all that big? I mean, they look like
Yeah,
they were
most of
dwarfing
them.
you.
Yeah, most of them, and some bigger. Like you think about like Raphael's Transfiguration, it's massive. Um, yeah, you may have seen the day we popped into this church. And this happens a lot when you're in Rome. Like you just pop into a church and there's like some super famous painting that's just like there, And the one of this amazing thing was seeing Caravaggio's triptych of Matthew, the inspiration of Matthew and the calling of Saint Matthew, and then the martyrdom of Saint Matthew, which I'd not seen before, but they're all right there. It's just you have
crazy.
several events like that that are pretty crazy. Yeah. So
Yeah, I think so. The gal that helps us with our social media, Sydney, she always asks us for quotes at the end of an episode. And I think one of the quotes in contention is January during COVID is the time to go.
for sure.
That's,
You're horrendous.
we could sell the rights to that to like Expedia or something.
Yeah,
I don't know.
probably get sued for that, so be careful.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little dicey.
Yep.
But okay, so so you have two more things on his Twitter. We're gonna jump to the last one, and then we'll go to author. But you also have on your host of Cars and Theology. Tell us about that. I just dabbled into it a little bit. Talk to us about cars and theology.
Cars, Coffee Theology. Is what
Yeah.
it's called. You can look it up on YouTube. Yeah, it was so fun. Obviously, it was inspired, by Seinfeld originally.
Mhm.
I think the conversation is a lot more substantive than what you hear. I mean, Seinfeld, Cars, Comedians, Coffee was fun to watch, just because you see lots of interesting, famous people. But obviously, the conversations weren't overly substantive.
Yeah.
But again, I have an old sports car, which coincidentally has been out of commission for quite a while, like 9 months or so. And I just today picked it up, had the clutch replaced and stuff. So that was pretty fun. I've
Nice.
done most of the repairs on it myself, and I did some clutch work, but it's a longer story. But anyways, I got it fixed, and so I just drove it today for the first time in like 9 months. It's fun. So it's an old sports car, and so the combination of that plus I just again am blessed to know a lot of people and be friends with a lot of really interesting thinkers and authors, and then I just love to talk. When I was a kid, I always joke, I wanted to be a DJ when I was a kid. So, the 1970s and 80s growing up, throwing some albums and talking between them, that was kind of like my dream. And so maybe when I grow up, I'll still arrive. But anyway, so the kind of combination of that, for a couple of years I recorded. I think we have 23 episodes up there. COVID killed it, is what happened. As all of a sudden, it wasn't,
Hmm.
Yeah.
kosher to be driving around 1 foot from somebody else in a car. So it killed it, and then life changed, and I just didn't get back to it. I might still. People often ask me about it, but basically, yeah. You can look it up on YouTube, and it's just me driving around with really interesting people of a wide range of interests and talking with them about their books. And yeah, those are fun episodes. Those are
Yeah,
fun.
it's a very, I mean, obviously right away if you've heard of Seinfeld's take on it, like right away I'm like, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And but it is, a lot better conversation to discuss theology rather than just kind of the ins and outs of comedy. But yeah, so that's fascinating.
Yeah, well,
And I
check
was
it out. And
wondering,
let me just say along those lines that it's interesting. Again, I do a lot of podcast interviews, and they're great, and I love to talk to people. But something different happens when you're driving around and you're not facing each other. And I've just found, like, we had great conversations. Not that this is going to be a horrible conversation now that we're facing each other, but I think of you. You're probably familiar with what C.S. Lewis says about the difference between friends and lovers. Lovers look each other eye in the eye. Friends are shoulder to shoulder, looking out on the world. And obviously, it's not the only way to have a conversation is to be shoulder to shoulder. But something different does happen in the car
Hmm.
when
yeah,
you're just kind of driving around. I don't know what it is. There's something kind of magical about it, and so it was a real joy to do that. So.
absolutely. That brings us to the last descriptor here, which is what we're going to get into talking about your book. But you are an author. And so we are going to talk about your book, Jesus, the Great Philosopher, Rediscovering the Wisdom Needed for the Good Life. And I actually don't know if Andy's the one that turned me onto this or if I stumbled onto it some other place. But do you remember, Andy? Were you the one
So
that
I read it and I was going nuts over it last summer, and then you said, yeah, I'd started it in like Audible or something. I think you had started it, but like I think you had a project or something, and then I think we all got back to it, and it was just really exciting after that. So
Yeah, I do remember I was on a road trip out to where was I? I was driving through like Wyoming. Oh, that's what it was.
oh, you're
I
on your way to Idaho, yeah.
when I went to the elk hunt. Yeah, and I was listening to it driving from Iowa to first Salt Lake
The
City.
real good life, the elk hunt.
Yeah. Well, I can remember it was like I was somewhere in, I think, Wyoming, and it was kind of like a misty, snowy day. And I'm driving around these loops in the mountains, like lakes and, trees everywhere. And it's kind of like snowing, sleeting. And I can remember that, like the conversation on politics and the polis, and getting into Plato and Aristotle. And I'm just like, man, this is perfect. This is the good life right here. Listening to this book, driving through the mountains. But then Andy's right. I got back to reality and didn't get to finish it until last night. So anyway, at least in the Audible version. But yeah, so let's talk about Jesus, the great philosopher. And so I'll just pitch it to you. And you said you wanted to be a DJ, and I will point out that you are a DJ. You're Dr. J. So I'll pitch it over to you.
Wow.
Impressive, Charlie. That was impressive.
Kick it over to Dr. J and just tell us how you got to this
Horrendous.
topic. How did you get motivated to write this book? Like, what was the lead up to Jesus, the Great Philosopher?
Yeah, that's good. uh, you know, what happened was, as I look back on the last 20 years of being a professor and writer, uh, I just very thankful to God because I just kind of interested and curious about a lot of things, and then I don't really I didn't like have this trajectory like in the next 20 years I want to write these books. It's always been kind of like I'm really interested in this, and then I spend time kind of getting it,
Mhm.
and then teach a lot on it or and preach, but then write a book, and then in the last several books, what's happened is as I got to the end of one book, I saw, okay, I need to kind of, it's like a lily pad to the next thing. Like I couldn't see what the next
Right.
thing I wanted to work on was until I finished this thing or near it. And that's what it was. The previous work was on the Sermon on the Mount and human flourishing. I mentioned that it was a 10-year project really of teaching through the sermon and thinking deeply about it, and then giving a self-education and ancient ethics and virtue ethics and Aristotle, et cetera. And all that finally culminated in a book, a pretty big book. I mean, I think very readable, but it's a 350-page book that's half argument about what the Sermon on the Mount is, and then half commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. And so as I finished that book and was teaching and preaching a lot, and especially the argument of that book is that Jesus really is offering the true vision of human flourishing. That and that was becoming clear that he's really being presented in the New Testament as a philosopher. As that was finishing, that wasn't the main point of that book, but I knew that's what I needed to do next, and to kind of expand it, to look at the whole Bible, and also to make it simpler too. So instead of a 350-page academic commentary, which again I hope is readable, but it's still a different genre. I wanted to write something with Brazos, which the Baker and Brazos people are good friends, and I've worked with them on quite a few projects now. But something at a more thoughtful level, they call it. It's not popular, but it's thoughtful readers, and to expand it and to make it more illustrative too. My Little Pony and various other things make appearances. You may have caught, and so yeah, it was really it's a next step in my mind of the whole vision that I've learned over the last 15 years of that Jesus' work in the world is very much a restoration of us to the fullness of what it means to be human. Which, if you know your Latin, that's what virtue means. Vir means human. Really, to be virtuous is to be human,
Mm.
as opposed to be vicious or viceful, which is what an animal is. So this idea of entering into the fullness of humanity, I think, is a really, really helpful way to see what the Bible is really about and what Jesus is about. And this book is trying to kind of explore that. So,
Yeah.
So why the connection to philosopher and wisdom?
yeah, I always joke that I had to fight for 2 years to get the publisher to keep the word philosopher in the title, and
No
the book
kidding.
the
Really?
book's done well enough, but I know that they uh, were concerned that from a marketing perspective, philosopher is a pretty negative term. But I decided that I really wanted to try to redeem that word because it does just mean a lover of wisdom and a teacher of wisdom. Really, ultimately, is how it functions. And the point is, you guys have read the book, is that um, this was a very common image in both sacred art and in literature from the very earliest days of Christians. They thought about Jesus this way, and they talked about him this way. And I wanted to try to recapture that aspect of that and bring that back into our Christian faith and hope and practice. Um, I like the word philosopher. I like the word philosophy, but it is an uphill battle. I know, because it's come to have very negative connotations, which is unfortunate. That's kind of the early part of the book, is that it doesn't have to. I mean, it was a great term in the ancient world. It's gotten really messed up in later centuries, but it was a great term, and I'm just trying to help us recapture it.
As you talk through Jesus, the great philosopher, you give kind of 4 compass points on philosophy, and they are metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics. And you demonstrate how both the Old Testament and the New Testament very clearly hit on some of these topics. We don't have time to look at all of them, but do any of those 4 jump out to you from an Old Testament or a New Testament perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are all deeply integrated with each other. So I think it is good to just kind of say the Bible is giving us a really clear vision of what the nature of reality is. That's from Genesis 1 on. It also is talking a lot about this big question of how do we know things? How do we know things truly? It's, of course, talking about ethics, but what we don't often realize is that the ethics is based very much on those first two things, especially metaphysics. In other words, to live well and to experience the good life, you have to live in accordance with reality. And that's why the Bible starts in Genesis 1 with a picture of what is reality. What does it mean to be human? Where do we come from? What is our relationship to God or a gods, or something like that? And then finally, a big part of ethics and living well is how do you structure relationships with each other? And that's what I mean by politics. So I can't really separate them because they're all four speaking together about this great human question of how do you find life? How do you find happiness? How do you find what we're made for? Shalom, if you want to use the Old Testament term for it.
So the this whole physics and metaphysics and the combination of the two, I found very fascinating from a proverbial and Old Testament perspective, and how wisdom is the order of creation. Wisdom begins with like physics. It's like before creation exists, and so as I read through that section, a lot of our world, and you mentioned this, is all about physics and science, but you can't really divorce it from metaphysics and the good life and human flourishing. So I had written that down, and I didn't know if you had any comment or any kind of
Yeah.
additional input to just the combination of those two, physics and metaphysics, and from an Old Testament theological perspective.
Yeah, it's good. Well, this was a big part of the journey of discovery for me, is to come to realize that the ancient philosophers didn't make that separation. That's a very modern phenomenon, to think about physics and science is somehow disconnected from the great human questions of where did all this all come from, and how do you live well within it, and what does it mean to be human? And we've so specialized and so split off the different areas of knowledge. This is a big part of the Enlightenment modern turn, is the specialization of knowledge, which has some advantages. I mean, I love my iPhone. I'm glad that you have on gynecological oncologists. For my, I don't mean that as a joke. I mean, my friend.
Yeah.
I have a friend whose wife is going through cancer, and I'm thankful for that level of specialization, right? But boy, the loss is huge. The loss of not having people that connect all the dots and put it all together. And that's what ancient philosophers did, and that's what the Bible does. That's the point, is it sort of makes these connections between all these aspects of what it means to be human, and speaks into them.
Yeah, that's actually what I think stands out as you start into the book, is you actually throw out some modern options of people who are trying to do this, but are very narrow in their scope. And probably I thought the funniest of them was, you mentioned Nick Offerman, also known as Ron Swanson, and how he presents like, this is what a man is supposed to be like. And he's a modern philosopher, but he's just so specialized. He's not giving me a full ethic. But then here's Jesus, who presents a completely all encompassing way to have a satisfied life. And I just thought that connection was, as I was kind of wading through those ideas, it just kind of clicked in my mind like, man, this is absolutely what Jesus is trying to do. Um, in that sense, you talk about, under the section in the New Testament ethics, you mention this, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, imitative or agentic ethics, where you're imitating, but then you, as the agent, actually have to have a certain morality. And that kind of harkens right back to Aristotle. But would you want to comment on that, how those two interchange together?
Yeah, sure. I'll just keep it really brief. But what I'm arguing there is what the ancient tradition was, and I think the biblical and Christian tradition has been what we can call virtue ethics. That doing what is right is not just a matter of obeying principles or laws. It's about you as a person being trained to see and be in the world in ways that accord with who God is. That's the idea, and what reality is, the metaphysical reality. as God has made it. So that's the basic idea of the virtue ethics tradition that we've largely lost in the modern period, but that was ubiquitous in the Christian tradition and the ancient Greek and philosophical system. So that's the idea that you learn how to do what's right by imitating. That's a big part of it, through habituation, through models, and that it really focuses on who you are as a person. That matters. Yeah, there's more we could say about that. I mean, I talk about this stuff a lot in class. You can think of just examples from jurisprudence that the motives matter. I know you want to talk about emotions later. We'll get to this. Our motives matter. The difference between manslaughter and first degree or second degree murder is not the act, but it's the motive, right? The interior person.
Mm.
Or you think of the great illustration John Piper used to give all the time of, like, if you showed up at your wife's door with flowers, at your house, and you knock on the door and your wife answers and she says, "Oh, you shouldn't have." You pull flowers out and say, and she says, "Oh, that's so great." And you say, "It's okay. It's my duty." Yes, you did the right act of giving the flowers, blessing, but it's not virtue because the heart is not attuned to it, right? This is the ancient and biblical and Christian understanding that who you are as a person matters in the act of morality.
There's a lot of discussion. You hear this commonly, that people will say that there's sort of this distinction between the head and the heart. And so then you get this idea that if I know something in my head, it's almost like that's a bad thing. And I need to know it differently in my heart. It seems like that can shut down thinking well about what the Bible says and about life. Um, how do you go about addressing that? Have you ever run into that? And then what are some ways how do you address that sort of an issue? Because it hits on what's going on here. Like, there is thinking, but there is internal change. And to really push one or the other out seems like a problem to me.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, again, there are a lot of a lot of complicated issues here related to what the nature of humanity is. But I think from a biblical perspective, a biblical or theological anthropology or nature of humanity would not make it such a sharp distinction as we do in the modern period between thinking and feeling, or thinking and the heart. In fact, in biblical parlance, the heart doesn't mean the emotions or affections, it means the inner person, the true person of who you are, which includes your reasoning and your affections, right? And your will, really. The heart is the real person, versus merely what you do externally. And so I think the short story is that I think we have been influenced by modern ways of thinking from the 17th century on that have not helped us think carefully about the integration of the human as both a thinker and a feeler and a doer, which the virtue tradition of old did keep together very clearly. I don't know if that answered your question. I hope it did, but in short
Oh,
way.
it does.
What would you say? Kind of, we can get practical here, but why is it important that we educate our emotions? Like, why are they so key to us as a person?
Yeah. Yeah. So the first half of the book is trying to just help us rediscover this idea that um, the Bible is a whole life philosophy, that it's providing us wisdom from God that isn't just for the religious aspect of our lives, but for every aspect of our lives. So that's the first part of the book. And then I turn and pivot and just try to say, well, let's look at three spaces where that really works out. What's the Christian philosophy? And so the three places I notice are emotions,
Mm.
relationships, and then happiness, which is this idea of flourishing. And in each of
Yeah.
those, then I first say, what did ancient philosophers say about this topic, and all the way up to like modern psychology and modern gurus, and then turn to the Bible and say, and what's the Christian philosophy on this, right? And one of the most surprising things for me to discover over the years was how important the topic of emotions was in ancient philosophy. Like, when you think of philosophy, you don't think like, oh, they're going to be talking about emotions a lot, but it turns out that's like that and friendship are two of the most important topics in all of ancient philosophy, because they realized that if you were going to live a satisfying, flourishing life, you needed to figure out those two things are really key. If you want to be happy, you do need to think about those two things a lot. So for me, those chapters on emotions, I mean, I've cared about these issues and have been involved in counseling and therapy and psychological things for a while anyways, but those two writing those 2 chapters was really important for me personally to kind of crystallize some thoughts on what exactly emotions are, how they function as part of what it means to be human, and then what does the Bible say about them. Your listeners may want to go, if you just went to jonathanpennington.com, and there'll be resources. There's tons of like talks and videos and all kinds of stuff on there. And I've given quite a few presentations, fuller than we have time for here, like hour-long presentations on the nature of emotions and how to educate them. So, they're just reference that might be something your listeners might want to look at. But in short, what I'd say is, yeah, emotions are a crucial part of what it means to be human. They're made by God. Jesus has emotions. More controversially, to understand this, God himself is presented as having emotions, but for sure Jesus does, and we do as humans. They're not a bad thing. And in a lot of Christianity, we are told to kind of squash our emotions or, be suspicious of them. And while it's certainly true that our emotions are not all that we are, and they can be misleading and misled, we can't deny that they're a primary part of what it means to be human, including in our moral decision making. Like I was just saying about premeditated, our motive. Our motive is related to emotions. That's the words are related to each other. And so what I try to do is just say, you know what, when you look at it's what do people in the world say emotions are, and kind of survey that. But then when you look at the Bible, the simplest way I'd say it is the Bible is the best, most nuanced, sophisticated, thoughtful philosophy of emotions compared to anything else I've read in psychology or philosophy. And that it both encourages us to embrace that this is part of what it means to be human, and that it's an important part of that, and also encourages us to learn over time to shape and educate our emotions in ways that are directed toward God and the good life, love and joy, and peace and patience. And those are all fruits of the Spirit, of course. And learning to consider what's true of God, and learning to cast our anxieties upon the Lord, for he cares for us. Learning to use our gifts of reflection and using our agency to practice thanksgiving. All these things shape our emotional life in very intentional ways. And that's a really important part of finding the life that Jesus is promising.
I thought it was
Yeah.
interesting as I read the book. You're presenting this picture that Christianity actually gives the whole life philosophy the best. And it dawned on me that I don't know if you intended it this way, but there's a slight apologetics argument going on behind it. Did you intend that to be like this is a defense of like the trueness of Christianity because it best matches reality?
I did not intend that,
Okay.
but I get that question all the time because that seems to be one of the ways that God is using the book and kind of helping us understand these ideas. I have heard from many non-Christians actually, directly or indirectly, Christians giving it to their non-Christian sibling or something, and it's I've heard from a lot of people like, my brother's a philosopher. I gave him this book, and he was very intrigued by this kind of thing, and so I'm very thankful that it is kind of serving an apologetic purpose. That wasn't my goal, but I'm glad for that. Yeah.
No, it's really. I thought it was fascinating the way that worked. It's almost like like the way Francis Schaeffer talks about people can live how they want, but they actually have to live in God's reality. It seemed like the book is describing that reality well. So, anyways, I thought that part of the book was I guess it was unintended, but hey, well done. That was awesome.
Great, thanks.
In the book, you talk quite a bit about Stoicism. And I think you said, maybe I got this wrong. You said it would be like your second favorite philosophy of life aside from Christianity. So I've been on Daily Stoic every now and then. I've kind of seen a couple of his videos and whatnot. What do you want to just summarize the parts that, if someone's familiar with Stoicism, like what are the parts that are actually maybe similar to Christianity? And then perhaps where do you see dangers? Because I do think Stoicism might be appealing to a wider audience out there. And so what's the part where Stoicism falls apart in comparison to Christianity?
You guys ask great questions, and ones for which I am really trying to limit my answers because there's so much to say. Yeah, I say it all the time. I think Stoicism is the second greatest philosophy of the world, with Christianity being the greatest philosophy. And I actually benefit a ton from Stoicism. I read the Stoics regularly, and have if you look in the book, the little coins you could buy. I have those coins. That's a picture of my actual coins. I mean, a friend, some friends got them for me as a semi joke, but I really think there's a ton of great, and there's a revival of Stoicism currently. Ryan Holiday is probably one of the main leaders of this.
Yeah.
And, he's great. I mean, to read Marcus Aurelius is good for you, and to read Seneca and others, it's really good. Epictetus and the Epicureans even are slightly different, but there's a lot of good in that. Yeah, so I'm very thankful, and what I really like about Stoicism is that it really emphasizes personal agency. It emphasizes personal responsibility for your own emotions, personal responsibility for your own actions, personal responsibility for your own virtue. And that's really good. I often feel like, man, if everybody would actually just read Stoicism, the world would be a way better place. A lot less sort of, complaining and victim mindset and things. So that's really good. However, it's this, you have to, this takes some kind of maturity of thought to live with. While it is an amazing philosophy for so many things, it is fundamentally wrong too. And it's weird to kind of hold those things. It takes a little maturity to hold those things together. But some of the ways in which it's so flawed relative to Christianity is that ultimately it's not real. In other words, there's a very it's not a realism, is what I should say more clearly, in the way that Christianity is a realism. It's dealing with reality. For Stoics, at the end of the day, it's quite similar to Buddhism, I think, in the sense that really the key to be happy is to kind of distance yourself from any negativity, including especially your own interpretations of life in a negative way. And while again, there's a lot of good to that, the problem with it is that there really is suffering in the world. There really is rape. There really is injustice, and that Stoicism ultimately becomes about you finding your own happiness by distancing yourself from all kinds of suffering. And again, the good of it is, to quote a lot of the Stoics, we suffer more in our imagination than in reality. I think that's true. I think a lot of our suffering is self-inflicted by our interpretation of events. The problem is that's not a sufficient philosophy for the brokenness of the world. And so I think Stoicism doesn't, in my mind, and maybe if Ryan Holiday were responding to this, he might say this isn't fair, but I don't think this is unfair. I don't think it provides an ability to really deal with the reality of suffering in the world, real suffering and injustice. And it doesn't really provide hope. And this is the great core of the Judeo-Christian faith, is hope that God is going to restore the world to the place of righteousness and goodness and shalom and beauty that we long for, that we feel in our bones, that we cry out against in suffering and in death. And I think Stoicism can only kind of say at the end of the day, well, as long as you worry about that, you won't be happy. But Christianity says that longing and that brokenness you feel is precisely what God is going to fix in the end. That longing that you feel is exactly the sign that you were made for something more than this. And the solution to happiness is to hope in God and to labor towards goodness and beauty now, but it's ultimately hope. And I think that fundamental orientation of Christianity towards a time when God is going to set the world to right is what really distinguishes Christianity from Stoicism in a fundamental way. And related to that, it can't really deal with guilt and shame. Like what does a Stoic do with guilt and shame? Well, you just kind of have to say, I need to stop worrying about it. You know what? There is real guilt. Yes, there's false guilt, there's false shame for sure. You know what? There's real guilt and there's real shame. And if without a mechanism of finding forgiveness in a relationship with your creator, you're never really going to be free. And so I feel like Christianity provides this sort of fundamental hope, both now and for the future, to be free from our guilt and shame and to be free from the brokenness of the world. So that's the distinction I would make.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Even thinking like 1 Peter 3, where we're expecting suffering, but the reason we can walk into it is because of the hope. That's very helpful. Thank you. That was a very helpful answer.
Good. Thanks.
I remember reading through the section you had on guilt and shame in the book, and that'd be another reason, reader or listener, to pick up the book and give it a read, because Dr. Pennington works through that, and that is a huge distinction between the Christian faith. Is that the Christian faith actually has answers to all of these emotions and feelings that we have without denying their existence. So that's great.
Let's just end off with just talking about friendship. And I thought you kind of walked through some of those aspects really well. This is what's central to our podcast, is reading good books with your friends. It's like, that's what we want to promote, is what we're doing here, taking a good book and then talking about it with your buddies. Why is that so crucial to a good life?
Man, I feel like we need like a 9-hour version that nobody would really want to listen to, because there's so many things I want to say. I mean, again, I do longer. Yeah, maybe so. I do longer talks on friendship, so I'll have to again kind of condense this. But yeah, here's a new way. I've been kind of talking about it recently. Just here's some new material I'll throw on you. That we are fundamentally we before we are I. That to be human is fundamentally to be to need community. I mean, there's a million ways you could argue this, but just think about, Genesis 1 and 2. Before the fall, everything is good, 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 good. And there's one thing that's said not to be good before the fall, and that's for the human to be alone. And then you think of the image of God is both male and female together. None of, even us males here talking, we are not the completion of the image of God by ourselves. It's both male and female to be in the image of God. And then, you just think about, just from the way that human gestation and development occurs. We are totally dependent on other humans from the very beginning, neurologically, psychologically, physiologically, socially. To be human is to be in need of others and to find life through others. So we are fundamentally we. And so that's one way I don't talk about it that way in the book, but I think that's one way to get at this. And once again, surprisingly, if you read Aristotle or Seneca or Cicero or any of them, one of their main topics is friendship. Again, when you and I think philosophy, we think, oh, they're off there, just talking about abstract things and, dropping as grapes are dropped into their mouths, But that's just the least thing that they did. What they mostly cared about was hanging out with their bros and talking about stuff and reading books together and figuring stuff out, and throwing discuses together or whatever they did. And so this, this topic of friendship was a big part. 2 of the 10 books of Aristotle's famous book on ethics for his son, the Nicomachean Ethics, 2 of the 10 books are about friendship. If you and I were writing an ethics book, would 2 of the 10 sections of it be on friendship? Probably not. But this is like this crucial aspect. So, and then you think of the great in the history. You think of the Inklings, right? I mean, you think of lots of people who have found life in friendship, and I certainly have as well. So then I try to trace that through in the Bible, that you have some good examples of friendship as well. And yeah, I got lost your question now. Sorry, I don't know what the question was, but yeah, it's a really important topic that is.
Yeah,
I think that's the answer. I mean, you're encouraging our listeners to have meaningful relationships and friendships. I remember you quoting, I think it was Aristotle, with the 3 different levels of the friendships, and that's awesome. And yeah, thanks for sharing.
Any final thought on why someone should read this book, Dr. Pennington, before we let you go?
I've got 6 kids. That's why. No, I'm so encouraged that you guys have read it, and it means a lot to me that it's been helpful for you. And I love this book in the sense that it really was very meaningful to me to kind of wrestle through these things and to fall more in love with God and His wisdom and His beauty as a result of reading or of research and writing this book. And it's encouraging that sounds like that's been a blessing to you guys as well. So thank you.
It has.
Thank you.
So, yeah. Well, with that, we'll cap this episode. And if you're listening, go ahead and head on over to FBBC Books and find it. With that, we'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Thinklings podcast. We would love to hear from you. If you have any feedback, suggestions, or potential topics that you'd like us to discuss, you can contact us through our email, thinklingspodcast@gmail.com. Remember, don't let this conversation end with this podcast. Read good books, talk about them with your friends, and always continue to cultivate your mind. See you next time on the Thinklings podcast.